Hello, and welcome to the first video interview that is part of a new series of ECMI Conversations with experts. Each month, we will invite a prominent expert to discuss a very specific topic with one of our ECMI researchers. This interview in particular is the first one linked to the international conference Minorities and Self-Determination, the 100th anniversary of the Post-World War I Plebiscites. That conference, as many of you know, was scheduled to take place right now in June 2020, but because of the coronavirus has been postponed to June 2021. My name is Vello Pettai. I'm director of the ECMI, and I'm delighted to start off this series with one of the keynote speakers from that upcoming conference, Professor Matt Qvortrup from Coventry University. Welcome, Matt.
Thank you.
Good. Matt Qvortrup is Professor of Political Science and International Relations at Coventry. He has had a very diverse and distinguished career, not only in academia, but also in the British civil service, the legal profession as a lawyer, and in broadcast journalism. So within political science, he is known very prominently for his work on referendums. And not only as a tool for direct democracy, as we often see it in democracies, but also as a political phenomenon, most recently in a co-authored article and study on how and why autocratic rulers use referendums to prop up their regimes. So in the context of our conference, our 1920 Plebiscites conference, we're interested in Professor Qvortrup's expertise in referendums and ethnic conflict, which just happens to be the title of a book he published in 2014. And it's important because we know that referendums are often used to decide other kinds of political issues, whether we want to extend a president's term in office or we want to decide on a social issue like abortion. But they're also frequently used to deal with ethnic conflicts and to decide how different ethnic groups or communities will henceforth live with each other. So I'm going to jump right in and start with that and ask the question that, in the broad scheme of things, as your book lays out so well, we have all kinds of referendums over the last 2 centuries. And how would you see the approximate share of these ethno-national referendums in this time period, as opposed to other types of referendums that I laid out before? And has this frequency of ethno-national referendums changed over time?
Well, I think if we take the number of referendums that have taken place, sort of nationwide referendums, and of course, in some ways, these are not nationwide referendums, but many of the nationwide referendums, there will be probably about 2,000 since the French Revolution, most of which are in Switzerland, of course. But if we take the Swiss out, they probably account for about half of all the referendums. But if we take those out, we would probably have, out of the 2,500 referendums or so, about 300 have dealt with or have pertained to ethno-nationalist issues. Now, some of them have been about referendums on independence. That's about 65, I think, and most recent count. Then you've had referendums on whether to grant self-government to different places. We've had, in the early 30s, we had them in Catalonia, in Spain. They actually demanded it earlier on, and there's been sort of quite a tradition for those there. And then there have also been referendums on whether you want to be incorporated into another country. We had Anschluss in Austria, which was hardly legitimate. But even at around the time of the French Revolution, there were some referendums on whether certain parts of that were not previously part of France, like Avignon, for example, wanted to join France. And at the time, it was quite interesting. There was the Pope referred to the outrage of the situation that the people will have to decide who their masters were. And he said that would be the natural consequence of that. And of course, now it's the gold standard that the people decide. So we've had sort of ebbs and flows of ethno-national referendums on independence and issues like that. There was a fair number in the 1790s, mainly in France, but also in Switzerland. Then there was a gap. Then the Italians voted in a number of referendums on the reunification of Italy, or Risorgimento. And then it was when present day Romania was established, it was also by referendum, not necessarily a fair one, I think one can say. And then in the mid-1960s, there were referendums that became used the Prussian government actually suggested the referendum should be held in Schleswig-Holstein. The Danes, expecting that the Brits would come to their aid, thought that was absolutely nonsensical and rejected that. Once Prussia had then won on the battlefield, the Danes wanted it, and the Prussians didn't want it. It was actually part of the Prague Treaty. But I'm getting carried away. Then there was another gap of 40 years where there were no referendums. There was a referendum when Norway seceded from Sweden, or when the dual monarchy was broken up there. Then a spike after the First World War. Then a bit of a gap. Some referendums in between. Western Australia actually voted to leave Australia. They were just ignored. It didn't happen. The Faroe Island voted to leave Denmark. It was just also ignored. There was a few referendums in the 60s, but it was sort of like one or two per decade. And in the 1990s, there was a massive spike of basically all the countries that became independent in the former Soviet Union and in what used to be communist-dominated Eastern and Central Europe were declared their independence following a referendum. Then it died out a little bit, but we've now seen a number of referendums coming back again, such as in Catalonia, where of course it's very disputed whether you can even call it a referendum. And we've had votes in Bougainville, part of Papua New Guinea. There's been in New Caledonia, and of course in Scotland here in the United Kingdom. So we've kind of come back to a higher than average point of ethno-national referendums.
So, as you just said, it's quite interesting that not all of these ethno-national referendums are quite the same. I mean, they're dealing often with slightly different problems. And in your book, you actually lay out a very nice, rigorous sort of conceptual framework for understanding these different types, 4 of them, in fact. So maybe outline those in greater detail for us.
Well, I think what I tried to do in my book was to say whether they were sort of harmonizing or non-harmonizing or unifying, or if they dealt with fundamental changes, if they're diversive or not. So you can have a referendum that where you homogenize a population, or you can have where you do the opposite. You can on the one hand completely split a country apart. Which is, what if you like, a political divorce settlement. You can also have sort of forced marriage counseling, which is like we were never enemies in the first place. And sometimes it's you have. I also call it an ethno-national referendum, where it's if you like, it's a situation where you basically try to paper over the cracks, where you say, well, we actually do have an a diverse population, ethnically diverse population. You just don't admit it. And then you have a referendum that forces integration by saying, and that typically takes place in my book, in countries that are not democratic. For example, there have been referendums, I mean, you alluded to the article I wrote with Qvortrup and Brendan O'Leary about plebiscites in dictatorships. And it's interesting that you have the likes of Mussolini, Hitler, Ceausescu, Bijok-Duvalier, Khomeini, Pinochet, sort of like the gallery of all the for want of a better word, bad guys, Ferdinand Marcos being one of them, have all had referendums. And typically they've had referendums that seek to eliminate any kind of heterogeneity, where they say we're all together. And Nasser, when he incorporated Syria for a little while into Egypt, it was the Arab Republic, I think it was called. The people weren't really, they were consulted, but it probably didn't matter much to them. So that's an example of that. So that's one hand where it's difference eliminating, and you can have a situation where it's difference, where you just make, say, okay, we don't like each other, we go our separate ways. And then on the other hand, you can have difference managing referendums. You can have one where you say, well, we need to have some sort of divide and rule. We need to all be here. We need to have a consensus of that. And that can be where you have referendums, as you had in Spain in 1931 to 33, in some of the ancient or older nationalities there were allowed to get self-government. You had the same in Scotland in the 1990s, in Spain again in the early 1980s, and for example, Denmark had it with Greenland, where Greenland gets more powers. So that's a different managing thing. Then you can also have other kind of difference management, which is what I call right sizing, where you sort of make sure that the state is right where it should be, and you can change borders. There was a case between Croatia and
Slovenia, I think it was. Right?
Slovenia, it was, yes, where they just say, well, we'll just deal with this as per referendum, and that legitimizes it. So you have these sort of quite different types of referendums, some of which almost appear banal, such as the drawing of borders, and others which are incredibly divisive, such as typically the ones on independence referendums. So I had,
No, I think, I mean, that is so important to see the breadth of it, because each, of course, ethno-political conflict is involving different groups, different sometimes within the state, outside the state, and all of these things. So it tremendously opens up the panoply of situations that we need to be aware of, and not just talk about one single broad category. In concerning the plebiscites that are of our greatest interest to us here in Flensburg are, of course, the 1920 plebiscites, as you've already alluded to, here in northern and southern Schleswig, that took place, helping to allow different villages and communities in this area to decide whether they would want to belong to Denmark or to Germany. And you call these then right-sizing, a case of a right-sizing referendum.
Yes,
so maybe we can elaborate on this application of that term to the Schleswig plebiscites.
Yes, and I think the Schleswig-Holstein plebiscite is very interesting. It's one which is very close to my heart in many ways. I have ancestors who were moved as a result of that conflict.
I think any Danish viewer will recognize your last name as somewhat Danish.
Yes, though there was some. Actually, most of my family were on the other side of the fence. So I might sort of take issue sometimes with the interpretation there, but it's interesting if you take the sort of the Danish thing is that, and I'll come back to the referendum afterwards. It has been an issue that where people say, well, the plebiscite sorted it out. And I think by and large, if one can quantify 80% of the grievances were sorted out by the plebiscite. And there is, of course, the old quip about Palmerston, who said that, there was only one solution to it. That was Prince Albert was a German professor and himself. And Prince Albert was dead, the German professor was mad, and he himself had forgotten. And I think the answer to it, what he might have forgotten, was that it was a referendum that could actually solve the problem. So I think what is interesting about it there is that. But it's also interesting is that if you take the Danish situation, I think in the Danish schools, people were still reading in the 70s a book called Rasmus fra Rødskov, which is about this sort of guerrilla fighter, basically, who fights all these Germans because the Germans would want to have their own country. They would want to join Germany. And from a sort of like democratic point of view, it's sort of like, yeah, but, it seems reasonable. I mean, I personally think it seemed reasonable enough that you didn't want to be governed from Copenhagen if you were a completely German speaker. That's perhaps a point of view that I have from my ancestry. Who knows? But I think what is interesting is that it did solve the problem. But even in 1920. The issue was, I mean, it led to what was described as a coup d'etat in Copenhagen, the Easter crisis. And I think it's often forgotten that that when the Radical Party and the Social Democratic Party, and the Social Democrats both in Germany and in Denmark were very much of the view that you should allow the people to decide. The Danish Conservative Party and Ep.1 Møller, who was the Musk, the leader, that was leaning on the king to say, look, you need to do something. You can't just have you need to make sure your kingdom is spread out.
Mm-hmm.
We can't just allow the Germans to vote. And of course, the king dismissed the centre-left government and put in another government, and they were, close to a revolution in Copenhagen.
Wow.
Because of this issue.
Mm-hmm.
The Christian X, who later was sort of became a legend because he was riding around in Copenhagen, supposedly with the David Star and so on, who became a little bit of a hero. He was actually the person who was instigated or what was very close to being a coup d'etat. Then he realized that he didn't have a majority for that. So all of that happened just before the vote. And I think it is interesting that I think it's often not mentioned that there was this massive issue. Then after that there was an election, and the Danes sort of realized, maybe it's not a good idea, and I think rightly so. It's interesting that all the areas of the Irredenters, where Hitler claimed that he need like Sudetenland and so on, afterwards they belonged to Germany. He could easily have said that Schleswig or North Schleswig or Sønderjylland was part of Germany, because there were large. I mean, what is interesting about it is that there were significant majorities in parts of Denmark where people voted for joining Germany. I think Abenrade, just north of the border, was German. It's still, when you go there, you can buy the Nordschleswiger, which is a German-speaking newspaper, and
we read it every day here at the center.
It's a very good newspaper. I read it every time I go to those parts. And it's so I think what was interesting about that referendum was that towards the end of the war, a Danish-speaking representative in the German Riksdag suggested a referendum should be held. Now, it's also interesting that even under now, when you live in Britain, you have an idea that the German Reich at the time was completely undemocratic. I mean, even minorities were represented in Parliament at the time, but which is worth bearing in mind. And the Social Democrats, of course, pushed for that. And in the referendum, I think what was interesting about it was that it was done in a way that so the southern part, I mean, they initially expected 3 zones of referendums, but they only had and this is getting, so we're all getting technical here, and and I apologize for the people for watching. But in southern, what the Danes called Sydslesvig, or basically Schleswig, in Germany, they voted en bloc and voted, I think, 80%. And I think there was wonderful poster seit 1000 Jahre sind wir Deutschen. We don't want to be Danes, and we don't want to be Jutes, so they want to join Jutland. So it was quite a subtlety there, and nevertheless, there was a majority that was very hefty. In Denmark, it was it was slightly less so. There was no area in southern Schleswig-Holstein, which returned a Danish majority. It was, I think, there's like a sort of myth when you talk to Danes. They say, well, Flensborg actually voted to be Danish. I'm afraid it did not.
No.
And it was quite a considerable majority. It just wasn't over 80% majority. But it was over 70%, I believe. Again, I'm sorry if I'm going into terrible detail here, but there were parts of Denmark. So the idea was that if certain parts of certain communes or certain parishes, I guess, had voted to become Danish in Sydslesvig, then they would have done so, but they didn't. And I think the good thing about this particular referendum was that it was so clear. The outcome was so clear, and it seemed to be a thing that was long overdue. Of course, it was also the first of several referendums that we had not in the same year, but also in what is now Poland and and Zophron and whatever the other
Exactly,
place.
and that's one reason why we also have another speaker at the conference, Volker Plott, who will be talking also very broadly about the different plebiscites right after the First World War.
Yes.
You mentioned quite fascinatingly all of the intrigues in Copenhagen, and that has led me to think of this kind of seeming paradox that in your book you explain very in great detail and give lots of advice and recommendations about how these kinds of referendums could be organized. I mean, we can think about thresholds, we can think about campaign rules, we can think about financing, all of those things, and they're very insightful. And then at the same time, in the book, you show that most of the referendums, however, that have taken place are sort of decided and initiated by politicians through pretty base kind of self-calculation. You even have the social science kind of formal model that illustrates the way in which politicians are calculating whether calling a referendum and initiating the referendum is actually to their political benefit or not. So it seems like we as political scientists are able to say, yes, this is the insights that we've learned about how to do things right, best practice, the famous word that you hear everywhere, and yet when as sort of hardcore political scientists we sit down, we realize that but the politicians do sort of what they want. And is this a sense that you get as well, and if so, why is that so?
Well, I think yes, I suppose the short answer is, and that's not going to satisfy you, so I'm going to explain why. I think politicians, I think it is a case of, if you like, how to manage self-interest, if you like. I mean, it's very much the sort of James Madison, I can't remember if it's the 10th Federalist paper, where it's like, if people were only angels, then we wouldn't need government. And then you have to, it's words to the effect that you need to channel the self-interest in a direction where it comes to the benefit of all.
Okay.
And I think politicians need to be operating within certain frameworks where we can channel those self-interest feelings to positive benefits. There is a wonderful metaphor in The Prince, Machiavelli's Prince, which of course in many ways was written in order to reunify Italy, which had fallen under the spell of the barbarians, which he called the French. The animosity there still, I suppose, exists. But he talks about how this sort of self-interest is like a deluge that comes in, and it can destroy everything. But if you prepare in advance that you'd have certain sort of canals and dikes and what have you, then you can actually you can protect yourself, but you can also use the force of the water to a positive benefit. And I think the same is true in political science. I think we can not only should we be aware that politicians are in it for themselves, but if we can use those sort of those energies that are created in a positive way, then I think we should. In referendums, it might be more difficult, but I think sometimes the competition that is there in democracies can be used to kind of like as a plus-sum game or a Pareto optimal situation, if we sound political scientists then.
No, and I think your book really exemplifies that. I mean, it brings to bear a lot of the social science tools that we have in terms of conceptualization, in terms of hypothesis building, in terms of sort of clear analysis, case structure, and all of that. And then at the same time, have in mind the kind of, which all too often people just blasé kind of say, oh, these are my policy recommendations at the end, but these are actually very substantive, empirical, if you will, or sort of to the point aspects and details of this phenomena that people can come away with and pass on to the politicians to channel the deluge of their self-interest that is piling on upon us day in and day out. So just to maybe wrap things up, I mean, you certainly studied these referendums quite a bit and compared them, and we know that there are some conflicts out there that are still simmering. You've already hinted at Catalonia, and we know that that's a big outstanding issue. Maybe there are others in Europe. I mean, then sort of then going into that practical perhaps direction, I know it's a little bit tenuous, but what can we say when we think about a Catalonia or any other perhaps hotspot in Europe?
Well, if we take Catalonia first, that is probably an example of a referendum that shouldn't have been held. But I think what is interesting also, if you, I think with all these referendums, I think you need to put them into context. And I think what was interesting about the Catalan referendum was that there was an interest on the part of the nationalist or Convergencia y Uno in Barcelona and Catalonia, to be hardline, and also Partido Popular in Madrid had an interest in being hardline because both of them were catering to their own crowds. So whereas the Socialist Party of PSOE in Spain were actually in favor on some sort of negotiated position that could de-escalate it. Then both if you were Rajoy in Madrid or Puigdemont in Barcelona, then each of them, the more radical they became, the more support they would get from their hardcore supporters. And therefore it was sort of like a chicken game where for some reason people decided, well, I'm just going to keep going, basically. And I think if I can stay with the chicken game metaphor, the expectation from people in Catalonia was that Madrid would stop at some stage. And then they would sort of, I don't even think they thought about getting to the point of declaring independence. But I think the chicken game, I'm sorry if I'm sounding really like political scientist now.
No, exactly. The two trucks or their cars driving into each other, and someone is expecting the other to swerve off in time, and the danger is that they actually collide, and
the problem is that one is driving a small Seat and the other one is driving a truck. And in that case, the chicken game didn't really work because it assumed both have equal size. But then it sort of de-escalated out of the way. And I think what was interesting about the if you like, and it kind of like undermines to a degree my analysis in my book, because I tried to look at the consequentialist logic and what's in it for me. But I think there is an element of the forbearance and thinking ahead that you occasionally have, like a logic of not consequentiality, but of appropriateness, perhaps, and whether that is consequentialist or not, that's a methodological issue, I suppose. But if you take the situation again of 1920, then immediately after the East, I mean, there was a referendum. It was decided. There was the Easter crisis and the coup d'état in Copenhagen, which was then avoided, and they got a democratic government again. They changed the election law so that to a proportional system, which would have made it more difficult for the right-wing parties to win. Nevertheless, the right-wing parties win a landslide in the election. Most of the Danish voters actually say, well, we would like that back. And then they have the Danish right-wing government or centre-right government decides not to change the election law, not to challenge, as they could have, the situation in Schleswig-Holstein. They get a lot of stick for that, actually, and they say, well, no, we think just in the long run, maybe we don't want to have skirmishes with the Germans, because at some stage they're going to come back. So there's that long-term thinking, I think, that is necessary. And if we can just come back to your question about the other referendums that are taking place at the moment, we have shortly a referendum in Russia that Putin has called, which I think in many ways is a referendum that is in my category of homogenizing referendum. And he's not going to get 100% support there, but he would get, probably get, whether it's going to be fair or not, I will probably question. But it's about whether Russia won the Second World War, and only Russia. Like one of the people, it's interesting. It's sort of history writing by plebiscite. So do you not agree?
Astounding.
And then you, of course, it's God only. I mean, Russia is a godly nation. and they don't like LGBT rights, and Putin should stay until 2036. Everything lumped into one question, but campaigned onto this. As far as I'm not an expert on Russia, but as far as I can understand, the campaigning slogan is that Russia won the Second World War.
Yeah,
never mind the Americans who were quite helpful in
no, and it's a very clear instrumentalization of the referendum idea.
Yes, and I think then you when you use the referendum in that particular way, it does become sort of homogenizing, if you like, and we've often seen that. I think it was interesting that 2 weeks before the invasion of Iraq in 2003.
Yes.
There was a referendum that was homogenizing, shouldn't we all go together? And Saddam Hussein got 100% support on 100% turnout. So all the Kurds, all the Shias, all the Sunnis all voted because we were all Iraqis. And that turned out not to be the case.
Okay, goodness. Well, then we see a few things still on our agenda to be studied, but we have for us a very good handbook through your book from 2014, Referendums and Ethnic Conflict. So, Professor Matt Qvortrup, thank you so much.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.